And this is ready as it'll ever be for the cab to go back down. Oh, it's making scary noises.
A lot of hours are going into this, but it's going to be so worth it. That first drive out of the shed, mate, I'm looking that forward to it.
Well, this is a pretty special moment. We're getting so close to this looking like an actual car.
I'm back down in the shed working on putting this BMW engine in an old Gear Patrol to turn it into the ultimate tough tourer. Last episode we pulled the whole car apart, separating the cab from the chassis and started rebuilding everything from the ground up. This build is all being done at home in my shed. And this is the episode where everything starts to come together. So hopefully it all goes smoothly.
I've got a fair bit going on this time. I've got to finish off the chassis, got to put the diffs together, assemble the lockers, assemble the diffs, put the new brakes on. The motor and gearbox have been kicked over in the corner of the shed for a little while now, but I'm finally going to drag them out. I've got a couple little mods to do to them and then the final assembly of the motor and gearbox and drop them in here. That's pretty exciting. But the thing I'm really excited about is if I play my cards right, by the end of this episode, that cab will be going back down in the chassis for one last time. So that's pretty awesome, but that means I've got a hell of a lot of work to do, so I'm going to get straight into it. First up, I'm going to take care of the front diff. I've got to finish off a little bit of the bracing and then clean up some of my welds, and then it's time to give it a nice spray of Raptor for some added protection. Well, I just got the diff out there hanging out to dry in the sun, so I thought while I'm doing that, I'll start fitting up these long arms. I've got to fit this drop box up here, and it actually, you can see that the arm usually mounts there, now it's going to mount back here, so it's going to be quite a bit longer. Mount these up, and I'm going to sit the arms in there, so when the diff's dry, I can bring it in, sit it straight in the arms, bolt it up, and it'll be good to go. I've just finished putting the drop boxes in, so the radius arms are next, and you know my little rule from last episode, anti-seize everything. So I've anti-seized the bolt, put these up, and then it's going to be nice and easy when I bring the diff in. Just finished spraying the new brace diff up, using a bit of Raptor so it's nice and tough because it's going to be under the car copping and hiding. And I've actually disassembled all the calipers so I can rebuild them, and I thought while they're apart, why not give them a paint too? Well, now this is looking good, it's time to take it and put it under the front of the car. But first, it's time to install some lockers. This is an exciting part, it's pro locker time to put the lockers in the new diffs of the car. Now playing with diffs is something that can be quite intimidating for the DIY at home mechanic, but let me tell you, these things are actually quite simple when you break them down into steps, so let me show you how I do it. First step is when you pull these apart, you want to make sure you know which side is which. Normally you do this with a punch, but I can't find a punch. I'm just going to start 2 little drill holes here, and then the other side I'm going to do 4, just so they're side specific and I don't get these mixed up. The next step along the way, I'm going to undo this little lock tab for the nut, take that off, and then undo these 2 big bolts and take the bearing cap off. Now the center's ready to lift out of the carrier, so this can be a bit tricky and you can lose these bearing races. But lift that out, it's quite heavy, and we're going to sit it down this way, so then it's easy for me to undo the crown wheel gear off the old LSD. This step mightn't seem like a big deal, but it really is. You've got to make sure there's nothing on the face of this crown wheel gear and nothing on the face of that, because they sit up nice and flush together. Get your compressor if you got one and blow out these holes, make sure they're nice and dry. Another thing you've got to be careful with if you're installing lockers, especially second-hand ones. Obviously I've got new ones, so it come with brand new bolts. But this means these bolts are a little bit different length to those ones because this is a different thickness. So just keep that in mind if installing a second-hand locker. Now I've pulled that crown wheel flush up to the locker with a couple of bolts. What you do is you get your Loctite and you get a paint pen, and all the rest of the bolts you put a bit of Loctite on and a dab on the top. Once you've gone around and rattled up all these bolts with the Loctite on, get your torque wrench out, set it to obviously the appropriate settings for whatever diff you're doing, and then just go around and check all the crown wheel bolts are done up to the right tension. Now the crown wheel's all bolted up to the locker, it's ready to go in here, but before you do that, don't get too excited. You got to drill a hole in here for the air fitting to come out. It's a little bit tricky on patrol rear centers, you got to make sure it doesn't hit the sway bar, but here goes nothing, eh? Well, the hole's drilled now and I've just tapped it, so this is the fitting I'm going to put in for the air. Put a little bit of sealant on this and I'll wind this in, but basically this is what the air goes from the locker to the car, to the compressor, and that's what makes the locker work. This is very important, so don't forget to drill this hole and put this fitting in, otherwise you won't have a locker that works. Another little trick that I learned from one of my mechanic mates many moons ago is if you're putting brand new bearings on like these, you want to put a bit of oil stabilizer, maybe even a bit of diff oil, just in around the bearing rollers, and what that does is sort of simulates the thickness of the oil when you're setting your backlash, so you get a much more precise measurement. When you're putting these big bearing end cap nuts in, what you want to do before you put the top cap on, what I normally do is just sit them in here and spin them around a couple of times so you know the thread's nice and clean. If there's any gunk like that in the thread, it comes out, because once this cap's on, if that gunk gets caught there, it can be quite painful. At the start, you remember I put these little marks on, that's just so this nut spins around nice. So here, it's nice and easy. Pick this one up, 1 dot, ready to go on. Just finished putting this bearing cap on, and there's this little bracket you need for the T-jam lockers. That's where the air ram sits to slide this in and out. And what you want to do is you want to put these down firm when you're assembling, but not super tight yet, because obviously these two nuts here on either side, you want to be able to spin them like this, not too tight, because that is how you set your bearing preload and your bearing backlash. And basically the backlash is the distance between the pinion gear and the cram wheel gear. Obviously you can't have it super tight because the diff gets hot and everything expands. So what I like to do is I wind them in till they're both firm, and then the cram wheel side I wind in till you can see the bearing race just start to spin, and that's enough preload on them. Whatever you do on one side, you do on the other side to move the cram wheel across to set your backlash correctly. I'm just setting up the dial gauge. The dial gauge is what you use to set your backlash settings. So it's quite tricky to set up, but once you get it set up, you sort of want to check it in 3 or 4 spots on the diff, just to make sure it's even the whole way around. You want to set it far out to the edge as you can. That's your most accurate setting. So factory specs for different cars are different things, but for this, we're going to be setting it at 1.5 to 2 mil. Well, just as I suspect, it's a little bit loose, so we're at about 0.25. So what we're going to do now is whatever I do on this side, I wind on this side. So for less backlash, I'm going to wind this out and wind this in to move the cram wheel across closer to the pinion. This is a quite fiddly part of the diff build. You need a lot of patience for this. It might look like this gauge is about to move a hell of a lot, but it's actually not much. That's 0.15 of a millimeter. So that's exactly what we want it set nice and tight. But yeah, it's not normally this easy. You can be playing around this for half hour, probably even more sometimes. The rules for these end bearing caps is much the same as the cram wheel bolts. You've got to torque them down with your torque wrench to the right settings. And a little thing you've also got to do is once you've torqued both these caps in, just double check your backlash again, because sometimes it can change when these clamp down a little bit on the bearings. In our case, it's all sweet. This is the air actuator here, and what this does actually moves this gear in and out, and that's what locks the locker in. So this has got a little bracket here, and I mounted in there. I fed the copper hose through. I've just cut this little copper pipe to size. So what I'm going to do now is you put this little O-ring over there, and then this fitting winds in and seals that. Obviously I'll put a little bit of seal on here. Last thing, I'll put this rubber hose on here, and I'll just get the compressor and poke it in the end. And we'll be able to check that everything is working. Well, time to test it, the moment of truth. That's a pass if you ask me. Now all that's left to do is put this in the diff and start assembling everything. I don't have any gaskets on hand. I ordered a couple, but they haven't come. So I'm just going to put a bit of sealant around here. Ready to go in. Nice bit of sealant around the edge. Obviously a gasket will be better, but a gasket was not available at this point in time. Something very important that goes on the diffs is brakes. So I've got a bit of spruce up for the brakes. I've been spoiled by the guys at Bendix. I've got a whole kit for the back. I've got new rotors, new lines, new pads and everything. So it would be rude if I didn't dress up the calipers. I've fully stripped them down and painted them. I did want some black paint, but they didn't have any there. So painted them nice and silver. Got a rebuild kit from the local auto supplies place, and I'm going to sort of rebuild the calipers. These look brand new. It would have been rude just not to touch up the calipers. They're all still working, but fully rebuilt. Hopefully when I bleed them up, they work. Well, new pads are in. I don't think I've ever had this much new stuff in my life, so it's pretty exciting. That's probably the flashiest set of brakes I've ever had. It's looking good, it's all coming together. Axles are in, brand new brakes are on, center's in, all the shocks are back in all round. Every bit of this car is going to be brand new. Just put this nice little braided brake line on, calipers are rebuilt, and yeah, it's just looking smicko. I've never had something this flash or shiny, I don't reckon, so I'm actually pretty stoked. A lot of hours are going into this, but it's going to be so worth it. That first drive out of the shed, mate, I'm looking that forward to it. Slowly making progress today. I've just got a couple of things out in the sun drying. There's all HUDs and bits and pieces for the front diffs. Fuel tanks all freshly painted up, along with the sub tank. Yeah, I might be able to put them on while I'm waiting for a few other things to try to put the front diff back together. Main tank's back in the back. All the brake hoses and fuel hoses, everything's connected. It's looking a lot more busy than it once was. Rightio, I'm sort of getting ready to put the cab back down on the car now, and I don't know if you remember, but this coil HUD here was actually bent up. So
that's actually done its toll on the body in the back. I'll show you what I mean. The floor here, it's all sort of pushed up, and this seam here, but through there, you can actually see daylight. All the red dust is coming through there. So I've got to hit this down and then re-spot weld it so the cab's all sealed up. Well, I actually forgot to film me touching up the spot welds, but it's all painted now. Put a bit of seam seal over. You can sort of see there's the spot welds that I re-spot welded. What I did was I put a couple of screws through there to clamp it back down, and then I just spot welded from there. The whole underbody of the car now is all painted, wrapped a tough undercoating. It's kind of like a stone chip coating. It's meant to be a bit of a sound deadener too, pretty tough. So the hole underneath here is looking brand new. Very close to the cab going back on. Everything's all repaired there. So we're making progress, people. We're making progress. Slowly chipping away at some jobs. So I've just put this new sway bar on, so the heavy duty aftermarket one. Longer mounts and whatnot. EFS linkages and front centers in now, so that's cool. Just putting the front diff back together. Probably definitely overkill, I'm going to say, for the touring wagon this is going to be. But I sort of learned this from being silly in the racing days. Kingpin bolts, I've replaced them with 12.9s. Also, these are 12.9 cap heads on the stub axle. Because obviously when I've been silly before and in racing situations, you know, sort of wheels turn hard up banks and winching up, I've actually snapped these bolts off before. This is overkill. The brace diffs are probably overkill. All the long arms are overkill. But hey, I'll be mad if I didn't do all these mods and I've come this far. I got a care package from my mate Ash down at Fusion Fab the other day, just in time. I wanted to do this before I put the gearbox back in. I've got the shifter in here. So it's full electronic shifter for the ZF. This is the later model one. So obviously some wiring. Loom, this is the CAN module for the BMW stuff. ECU mount, which is very nice. Shifter mount, reflushed ECU, very good. Now if you remember many moons ago, just before I sent the loom off, I sent the Megatronics off out of the gearbox. And this is what this is. So before I put it in the car, well, I can do it upside down. I'm going to put this in. It's been a while, so hopefully I can put this back in without too many leftover bolts. Might chuck these on a time lapse and see how we go. Megatronics is all back in the gearbox here. I had a set of instructions on my phone that Ash emailed through to me, told me which bolts to undo, all that sort of jazz. Went back together pretty easy. The bottom pan is the whole filter in this gearbox. Obviously I've got one on the way and I will change it. Just put that on for now. That's why I didn't torque up the bolts to spec. It will be coming off. Easy to do on the car. Just wanted to put the Megatronics in because it's easy to pull the valve body out when everything's upside down. Couple of questions last episode about why I had to pull the Megatronics out. This is the later model ZF6 gearbox, so it goes with the cast iron M57. It's full electronic, so no shifter cable. So obviously had to pull the Megatronics out to get it to talk to my older ECU. Meant to be a better box, arguably, but we'll see how we go. I've got a couple of mates with Barra Patrols ZF6s, and I am super keen to drive my thing with this in there because they're just smooth. You can't even feel them change gears. I briefly touched on this in the last episode, but this episode I'm actually going to do it. So what we're doing is, obviously this spline here is a lot finer than the old Patrol gearbox spline, and you can see that properly. So included in the kit, this is a brand new gear made by Ash. It's unreal. So I'm going to fit that into the Nissan Transfer, and yeah, the best thing about this not being a reduction gear is I don't have to pull the transfer apart at all because it's not any bigger. So theoretically speaking, undo this front cover here, pull that off and change gears, but we'll see if it's that easy. So we've got the new gear in the transfer, the Megatronics back in here, everything back on the adapter on. It is 11:40 PM. I've had a decent night. Front's all back together. Transfer's done, gearbox is done. Ticked off another couple of little jobs. So it's going to be a big day tomorrow. But if all goes to plan, all three of those things will be bolted together. And that we bolted down to this. Once that cab's back on over there, it'll be looking like a car again. And yeah, I'm super keen.
Righto, I've been flat out in the chassis assembling everything, diffs in, brakes on, you name it, I've bolted it on. There's a couple things left to do, but first I'm gonna put the wheels back on so it's a little bit lower. All the wheels are on now, so it's time to jack it up, pull the jack stands out and drop it down its own weight finally. So I can push it out a little bit, wheel the motor in the front and hopefully drop it in nice and easy. Fingers crossed everything lines up like it should. Oh, it rolls so nice compared to how it did before. Well, next up is a little bit of a tricky job. I've got to make a Nissan transfer case for your friends of the BMW ZF Auto, but thankfully Fusion Fab has made that super easy with this flash looking adapter. I've got it all set up, I've changed the transfer gear, so this should slide on super easy, and I've got to bolt it together, and then I'm one step closer to putting the motor in that car. I'm getting bloody excited. Now I've got the transfer case all bolted up with the adapter on, it's time to put the torque converter in. So I've just cleaned out the bell housing, made it all nice and clean, and I've got to slide this on. Now you've got to be careful when putting these on, you don't just jam them in, you've got to bend down there, put a torch in, there's two little keyways which line up with this. You've got to put it on there, then start twisting, you'll feel three little clunks, and that's the torque converter locking onto the pump. If you just push it straight back, you'll wreck your pump, so be super careful and take your time when doing this. Well, I've just got it in there now and you can feel, so you give it a little rock and it's free, and then you spin it past the click and then you can feel it actually spin the auto. So it's just a super tricky job, but you got to really take your time because you can do some damage if you just go hell for leather in here. Before I take the motor off the stand and get it ready to bolt to the gearbox, one little mod you have to do here is cut this section of the sump out. You've actually got to be quite careful because some of these are like sort of hollow and you can cut all the way through. But basically this is where the drive shaft went through when it was in the X5, and this is where the Patrol diff will sit. So I've got to cut this out for clearance. So seems to be a messy, noisy job. Well, I'd seen online that this is a mission of a job, and they're not wrong. There's just, the saber saw is not long enough, and the grinder is just, you know, it's just, you sort of got to cut your way in there. You've got to keep cutting and bashing bits off, and then at the end, hopefully smooth it off, make it look half bad. But I just got to remember, you can't go too high because then oil will be on the ground. It's, yeah, it's definitely one of them jobs I can understand why I've left it so long to do. Alright, well I finished shaving the sump. That was a mission of a job, and the engine is off its stand. Now I've got to put the flex plate on and sort of the backing plate, a few bits and pieces, and work on bolting them all together. So we're getting to the pointy end of getting this motor combo in. I've got the motor roughly sitting where it needs to be, and the transmission is actually nearly at about the right height. Obviously I could put these in separate, but ideally, because I don't have any cab or anything in the way, I'm going to try to do it in one package. So I'm going to join them on the floor. That was a little bit tricky, had to sort of chop the trans up on some old bits of steel, engine crane under the front of the motor, wiggle them together to get the dowels to line up, but I got them bolts done up tight and heard the click at the end when everything locked in. So it's good to lift in now. I'm actually going to do the bottom bell housing bolts and the torque converter bolts when it's in the car, a bit easier to access and stuff, but now I've got to try and pick this up and balance it somehow. As I said before, I'm going to try to put this all in as one package. So I've got one strap here, I'm going to get it up and then probably balance it different ways with other straps. There's going to be straps everywhere, but if it all goes to plan, I'll be able to sit it in there in one go. Now that I've got it all off the ground, I'm just putting the gearbox mounts back on. I've got to bolt the engine mounts back on, and then hopefully I can sort of lower it down and get these to line up. I'm going to leave them loose in case I need to slide them, and once it's in position, I'll tighten them all up. Just fitting the engine mounts back up after I've painted them. They're looking quite smicko now, and I might even just sit the rubber on this end loosely, so as I drop it down I can line it up and slowly bolt it in. Oh, it's making scary noises. Well, we're getting very close now. I'm just wheeling the chassis in under the engine, and if all goes to plan, it'll be sitting in the chassis. Oh, go slow. I love it when it all lines up like it's meant to. Well, have a go at that. The engine crane is unhooked. It's sitting in there on its own weight, and I'll tell you what, that couldn't have been any easier. All the mounts lined up, all the little dowels on the locators and everything lined up perfect. And if you can't have tell, I'm getting pretty bloody excited now. We're getting so close to this looking like an actual car. How cool. Everything was looking so good, all sitting in there. There was a bit of dirt and grime and everything, so I thought I may as well give it a gurney while I haven't got a cab in the way. It's all washed up and it's looking quite flash, and this is ready as it'll ever be for the cab to go back down. So let's waste no time, push it in and drop the cab back on. Just fitting up a brand new set of body mounts before I drop the cab down so it sits nice and there's no creaking noises in there. It's pretty much going to be a new car when I'm done, I reckon. Well, this is a pretty special moment. This is sort of the moment that's been keeping me going, pushing through all this work. Pretty crazy to think that the cab's going back down. When a couple of weeks ago, this chassis was sitting out there bare and looking bent and battered as ever. Now it looks brand new if you ask me. So let's see how many goes it takes me to get this cab back down. Oh, few noises. Well, I think we all knew this was going to happen. It wasn't going to go down first try. The chassis is probably about 50 mil too far this way. So instead of me wheeling the whole thing back out, I've jacked the back up. I'm going to try to push it over. Might try the same with the front. Fingers crossed I can do that. I think that's it. There's air between the hoist and the car and the body. Looks like it's sitting down where it's supposed to be, everywhere, I think. Well, that's exciting. That's super exciting to get to this point. Mightn't seem like much, but it's been a lot of work, big couple of weeks. And I'll tell you what, it's an awesome sense of achievement here. I've got a big smile on my face, you can probably tell. A hell of a lot of work in the underside of that car, and I'll tell you what, I'm glad I could show you guys what it looks like, because you can't see it now. To have this motor sitting in here, it's quite a special feeling. As I said in Ep1, I've had this thing sitting around for about 3 or 4 years now, and it's finally in a car, all mounted up, ready to be wired and plumbed. I'm still waiting on a couple little fiddly bits and pieces to get the GU running, but I didn't want to waste any time because I'm super keen to get this thing out in the tracks. So I've jumped the gun a little bit, I know. I've gurneyed the bull bar and I'm going to fit my brand new EFS winch in the bar, so it's ready to go when I've got that thing running. Righto, time to get this winch bolted into the bar. All these sort of low mount winch styles, they've all got generic mounting points, so no matter what winch you've got, they fit in here. So the EFS one fitted in, no worries. I've just finished doing up all the bolts, and this fairly looks very nice with the branding on the front. I'm going to jump around the back now and do all the control box wiring, so it's ready to go when I put it on the car. This thing's super easy to install. It's even got a mounting section on the winch to mount your control box. I'm just doing the wiring now, and that's made super easy. Beautiful. That's all the bolts and the winch done up, and I've done all the control box wiring here. I've got them on and got the nice little covers on. All I've got to do is run my positive and negative wires to the battery when it's in the car. And the cool thing about this winch is it's got a built-in breather, so I've got to run that up nice and high when I've got it in the car. This is actually the same style of winch I've got in Darra, and I'm really impressed at how it's going. It's just a super good unit. So I'm actually kind of keen, never thought I'd say this, I'm keen to go and get the GU stuck to try this thing out. Thanks heaps for watching, guys. If you've got any ideas or questions about the build, chuck them in the comments and I'll have a look. But for now, I'm going to get straight back into it, and I'll see you guys for Ep 3.